Day-Mah protest, December-January protests. And even more recently, just today, if I'm not mistaken, she helped co-edit a set of essays that appear on the Jadaliya website that looks at war, sanctions, and political crisis in Iran. Dr. Aida Niku received her PhD in sociology from SUNY Stony Brook, where she taught political economy and social theory. Last, but definitely not least, is our good colleague Nahid Siamdous, who's assistant professor of media and Middle Eastern studies at the University of Texas in Austin, or at Austin, I guess is technically what it's supposed to be. Yeah. She is the author of Soundtrack of Revolution, The Politics of Music in Iran, which was published in 2017 by Stanford University Press. She's also co-editor of a forthcoming volume by Harvard University Press titled Iran Amplified, 100 Years of Music and Society. This year, she is the EUME Fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in Berlin, where she is writing her new book on Iran's post-revolutionary public and media sphere. She is also the host of the Iran Cast podcast series and has done a TEDx talk titled Dance for Life. Okay. For those of you who are in the back, there are a couple seats further in front if you like. So let me begin by having us situate these protests historically, and here I'm going to turn to you, Ervand. You're a student of protests, oppositional politics, and revolutions in modern Iran, and as I just mentioned, you've written several volumes unpacking and dissecting these processes. And I was curious to know, in these past few weeks, as you've witnessed and watched and learned about the protests in Iran, what aspects of this current cycle of protests and oppression and repression seem to you as familiar or echoed with the historical episodes that you know so well? And to what sense are these protests building on past repertoires of collective action? And conversely, or maybe alternatively, are there aspects of these protests of these past few weeks notably different or exceptional in your eyes, that differentiate them either maybe from protests in other periods of the post-revolutionary era or even in comparison to a longer historical framework?
It's a good question. If we look at Iranian history, the crowd has often played a major role in politics, whether it's the constitutional revolution, the labor movement in the 1940s, whether it's the oil nationalization crisis, and of course in the 1978-79 revolution. But these crowds in the past were mostly processions, organized demonstrations, rallies, and often the final straw that broke the opposition was in fact a general strike. When we look at the more recent ones, post-revolution, what you're seeing is actually two very different issues. One is they're not so much organized or rallies or processions, they're much more spontaneous uprisings, revolts. Some people like to call it revolutionary episodes, which is a fancy term, but what they mean is basically grassroots uprisings, protests. So that's one basic difference. And so of course, as far as so far, we haven't seen a general strike to bring down the regime. A second factor I think is important is that the present one, and some of the earlier ones also after the revolution, were basically triggered off by economic crisis. Economic crisis brought about by sanctions. These incredible sanctions, they're basically embargoes, but the term embargo is not used because it's internationally illegal, so they've coined the term sanctions. But these horrendous sanctions have basically squeezed the middle class dry and increased dramatically the poverty level. So you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a Karl Marx to figure that if you have economic squeeze, you're going to eventually get discontent. And that discontent, if it doesn't have channels to express itself, it's going to express itself in streets, revolts. So in many ways, it's predictable what is happening now. So the question, and often I raise to myself, are what are the reasons for the sanctions? Because people who are imposing the sanctions must know what the end will be. So what is their end game? So these are, I think, two differences. One complication which often people forget is right after the revolution, 1981, there was also a very similar outburst against the regime. The Mujahideen actually tried to overthrow the regime by bringing massive people into the street, and they thought that would actually, the regime hadn't consolidated itself, so it was actually quite insecure at that time. They failed because the regime was, even though it didn't have real revolutionary guards on an extensive level, it was willing to use massive force. It executed 11,000 people in a few months, basically targeting the Mujahideen, but it took also the opportunity to target a lot of people who had nothing to do with the Mujahideen, had absolutely nothing to do with the revolt, but they had opposed the theocracy. So people on the left, people on the National Front, secularists, they were all wiped out in this basically bloodletting after that. And of course the regime survived through that terror. So the present crisis in some ways is very similar to that Mujahideen uprising in 1981-82. Here, of course, the Mujahideen no longer has a role. Somehow the image of the Pahlavis has risen out as a ghost to replace the Mujahideen. But otherwise, the present crisis or the present protests are very different from the historical demonstrations on street organized rallies of Iranian history. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let's pick up on the theme of the dire economic situation that's affecting many different classes in Iran. And here I'd like to turn to you, Ida. You've done a lot of research on working class activism, protests and strikes that oftentimes don't get much attention here, at least in mainstream Western media. These are everyday actions, strikes, blockages of roads, sometimes related to issues around the environment and ecology, sometimes connected to pensioners and so on and so forth. First of all, I'm hoping that you could share with the audience who may be less familiar with the kind of working class struggles that, again, appear on an everyday basis. Share with us, what are the main concerns? How are they related to maybe the sanctions, if you feel that's important? But also, maybe if you could reflect on how we should think about kind of these political struggles that are at the more micro, localized level to these large, massive uprisings that Iran has been going through periodically since 2009, but more recently, 2017, 2019, and of course, the Women Life Freedom Movement. So if you could connect the two different scales of protest, if you will.
Yeah, so kind of, backing up on what Ervan said, I feel like this is too loud, no? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So, yeah, to understand the current uprising, the day uprising, I think we need to contextualize it in kind of a decade-long everyday struggle of survival in Iran, right? So over the past decade, I would say at least since 2017, the labor organizing in Iran goes far, before that, obviously, but Since 2017, we've been seeing a continuous form of labor movement. I mean, there are some debate around whether it's a movement or it's not, but we see labor struggles. There hasn't been a single day where we haven't seen a labor protest somewhere, and that includes labor across the sectors. So service sector, industrial sector, oil, petrochemical, pensioners, nurses specifically, since the COVID. And so what these workers are demanding are the basic survival, demands. These are, the people working class are demanding wages adjusted to the inflation, the soaring inflation. They're demanding secure job contracts. They're demanding better, work condition, and essentially job security, to be able to live. So these are the kind of demand that has been going on, and so when we look into the type of strategies that these working class movements, these labor uprising or protest they used a whole host of reason or infrastructure, including the state-backed institutions of Islamic labor councils, the House of Labor, so all sort of things. And typically, what happens is that the state, in the beginning, ignored them, and then when they escalate. What happens is that usually the top organizers get retaliated against, so they get put in prison, and the rest of the movement is somehow co-opted by giving them some very basic concessions, but temporary, right? That's the key, temporary. There never exists any form of structural, real, long-lasting concessions out of all of these protests that are happening. And so what happens is that grievances don't end. Right? Grievances are still there, and they keep getting worse and worse with the whole economic situations. And so what happens is that these grievances accumulate, and then they kind of spill over to the street, because when there's no infrastructure, a legally recognized infrastructure to meet these workers, at the workplace level, then they have no other choice but to go to the street. And so you see this in the form of the uprising that you see. So there's a common mistake in the media usually to separate these two. They're like, this side is labor, protest, they have economic demands, and this sides are the recurring long cycles of uprising that we've seen since 2017. As Orang mentioned, 2017, 2018, 2021, and 2022, and then most recently in 2026. And what is interesting is that all of these long cycles of uprising, they have been, increasingly happening in the geography of exclusion. And so in the peripheral provinces that are essentially undeveloped, and the poverty is, the poverty rate is really high in those areas. So you do have like a sort of a, convergence of, these sort of, demands that are, kind of like met with labor demands. And so typically the media will say labor joined the uprising, but that's kind of, I think that's reductionist to look at these, because the demands are essentially the same. And so one example is that, for example, less than a month before the day uprising in Azar, there was one of the largest oil worker strikes in Iran. 5,000 workers went to the street in Asaluye demanding for very basic, wages. And interestingly enough, they were organized by political factions close to, to the establishment, right? The justice faction, most specifically. So they weren't revolutionary or any of that. They completely got dismissed, even by the national, labor news agency, for example. It was downplayed. No one really asked, what is your demand? What's going on? And so 3 weeks later, the uprising, broke out, and these workers came out to the street, and not in support of, it was a continuation of what they were demanding before, but at the same time, they were supporting the uprising because they could see, the overlapping demands. So I think it's important to see, you know, to kind of contextualize and historicize these moments of eruption, so-called, because otherwise then you would have, you know, kind of narratives and accounts that will call them kind of engineered by external forces, or just call them, you know, just, you know, spontaneous, not in a sense that Ervana explained, but spontaneous in a meaning of like they just came out of nowhere, right? So the whole point is that these uprisings are in the back of a long, lasting, and several decades-long labor demands to the state that essentially is, you know, not really granting them any form of concession. Yeah.
Thank you. Nahid, if I can turn to you and ask you to kind of use your expertise to reflect on what you've been watching this past couple months. You're, of course, an expert in popular music and culture and media. And a lot of people have commented on that, you know, these protests, not just this time, but maybe especially during the Women Life Freedom protests of 2022, there's a large degree of cultural symbolism and motifs and kind of performance involved in challenging authority and making demands on the political system. So I was just wondering, like I did with Iran, you know, what caught your attention both during the protests in December and in January, and maybe since then, especially as we've been witnessing burials becoming spaces or moments for protest, 40th day commemorations this past week, likewise. And if you could draw some maybe historical connections, or maybe these are really truly revolutionary ruptures that in political culture that you're witnessing.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So in preparing for this year, I was going through, you know, Instagram posts that I had saved, and you know, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of us here do have family and friends in Iran, and that it's been such a painful period, and that a lot of us are sitting here with a lot of grief, and I just want to acknowledge that. So there have been some continuities, but also a lot of ruptures, and I want to sort of point to the first sort of that I've seen coming up in these you know, in these protests. The first, of course, is the length of the internet shutdown, not just internet, communication shutdown, right? So that people, even among themselves in Iran, through landlines, cell phones, couldn't communicate with each other. For more than 2 weeks, really leading into 3 weeks, people couldn't really get news from each other. And so what this meant was that there was a vacuum of information and communication that both meant certain posts that would come out of Iran would get a lot of prominence, and also that there were, you know, both state-affiliated and non-state actors who could really get into this space and infuse all kinds of information, misinformation, disinformation, and this was happening from all sides. So this vacuum created a space whereby, you know, even the Islamic Republic itself, for example, got involved in you know, creating clips where superimposing Javid Shah on certain protests, only to then go back and say, you know, these were fake, and creating doubt about the veracity of posts that were out there. So just kind of, you know, creating a lot of doubt about what was actually happening out there. So in the space of that shutdown, being able to carry out what it did, and it also left a lot of, for the first time, we have AI be really active in this space, creating certain posts that were not real. And so there was generally a lot of confusion and doubt about, you know, what was happening on the ground. And what this shutdown also meant was that once information did come out, there was really an avalanche of it, right? After 3 weeks, we were hit by name after name after name, face after face after face. And this was truly astounding. And, you know, all kinds of parties got involved in trying to have verified information about the number of the dead, which, you know, we still don't know. We know it's many, many thousands, but those numbers are still not verified as of today. So that's been a first. Of course, communication shutdown has existed before. During the Green Uprising that I was reporting on the ground, cell phones were shut down, text messaging and all of that was shut down for several days. And then again, during Women Life Freedom 2019, actually the Bloody November protest for a whole week was shut down. But this really was a first. The other first really was that, you know, people came out into these protests bringing their children, their elderly, in part sort of relying on Donald Trump's promise to protect them, go out there, we've got your back. And so this is for the first time. I had not seen protests in the past where so many people came out with their children. These were family events, family gatherings, and so that's why we also saw a lot of children killed, at least 200 school children, although I'm sure the numbers are much higher, and also multiple family members of one family being killed, right, because people went out together. There were, of course, a lot of, iconic images that, like previous protests, united Iranians around a certain understanding of what these protests meant and what their political aims and goals were, including, the young woman who who lighted her cigarette with an image of Khamenei, the incredibly, heartbreaking images of the Kahrizak morgue, where especially that 20-minute-long video where the father was looking for his son, Sepeh Baba Kojai. Body bags include especially one, Zan Nashinas, number 12760, this woman who had not been identified, and this number itself becoming sort of a very clear sort of signal or symbol of the depth of the violence and brutality. One video stood out to me, which actually speaks to what Aida and Ervand here have mentioned, which was from a funeral in Kermanshah, very poor, destitute neighborhood, and there were two brothers who were killed by the same family. And in the foreground we see women and men sort of putting dirt on their heads as a traditional form of warning in some areas. And in the background on this mud wall you see morgh zende, live chicken, right? And if for all of us who've been following Iran over the last few years, we know how much people have become impoverished, so much so that a lot of people are unable to buy eggs, and so even if they have a little balcony, they'll have live chicken in order to be able to have eggs. And so, this sort of graffiti of, this advertising for live chicken in the background of this incredible sort of destitution of two brothers of the same family, two breadwinners having been killed in these protests, kind of brings home this point of, why in so many ways this uprising seems like the end of the line for the Iranian people as far as their government is concerned. Other scenes that really stood out is because of the masses of people killed in Behesht Zahra. These masses of people waiting for the corpses of their loved ones to come out, that itself became a protest. And so they were chanting Marg bar Khamenei, in scenes that we have never seen before. And when the corpses would finally come out, people chanting Baghirat, right? The people who had been killed are those with honor, and they have given their lives for the nation. Another first, I did not know, I'm not aware of this having happened before, but the government basically telling parents that if you allow your children to go out onto the streets, there's a chance they will be killed. We're just letting you know, just be notified that we will kill your children. These were text messages that Iranians received, and this is something that I hadn't encountered before either. Another first, of course, are the comparisons to the Holocaust that Iranian social media users have been drawing. This is, of course, because of the kind of affinity that certain diasporic groups have had or felt with Israelis, because of this antagonism that has been constructed vis-a-vis Palestinians and the Gazans, and so drawing affinity to the Jews. And so we see these recurrent themes to the Holocaust. For example, Mehdi Arahi sang a song by the name of Auschwitz, or the title song of Schindler's List was superimposed on a lot of these posts. The burning of mosques was another first to this degree. The number of the burning of mosques, we can talk about the government said these were terrorists or instigators, but obviously there's a very, very prominent anti-religious theme in these protests that we have not seen to this extent before. Women Life Freedom certainly had a bit of that, but even in Women Life Freedom, the women activists made sure to say, at least the prominent was, that this is not an uprising against the hijab, it's an uprising for choice, for having the freedom of choice over hijab, right? So I think this anti-religious strand in the protests is really came to the fore in the joyous mourning ceremonies that we've seen. I just had a piece published today in a place called Hypotheses, where I write about these mourning ceremonies. But the way in which, very organically, in these funeral ceremonies, people have staged celebrations rather than mourning, doing away with Quranic recitations, with eulogies, and really using the language of joy to celebrate them as heroes. This, of course, didn't come out of nowhere. I think one important factor that sort of partly contributed to this is actually another novelty of these uprisings, which is the prominence of the Lur minority. If Women Life Freedom really sort of, raised the Kurds and the Baluchis sort of were the two prominent minority groups in the Women Life Freedom uprising because they give the most dead, because of Mahsa Jina Amini, obviously, and Xinjiang Azadi even producing the Women Life Freedom slogan itself. In these protests, because a lot of people were killed in Lur provinces, in the cities of Izeh and Abdadan and so on, and because we saw early dances by mothers for their children, this is a Lur custom of honoring especially the young dead with dancing. It's a sort of defiant dance rather than mourning. This kind of fed into these joyous celebrations that we see. But it also came from a language that Iranians have constructed among themselves in private spaces, on social media, viral dance videos, singing this of women mounting these sort of joyous counterpublics on trains in the streets. It's really a language that mostly women have constructed over the last few years, and again in these funerals. And so this language really sort of erupted in these in these joyous mourning ceremonies. And again, women were the narrators and the leaders of these ceremonies. Women were really scripting anew what this nation should stand for, and it should stand against everything that the Islamic Republic stands for. And so they've done away with all these Islamic signifiers. And what was interesting about that is that, for centuries, Iranians have had a language for how to mourn. There's certain nohe, there's certain Quranic verses that are read. There's very explicit, crying at the funerals. These funeral processions were all joyous, but what was interesting was that they were all a little bit different, right? People did all kinds of different things. So this diversity of culture also politically spoke against a sort of unifying dogmatic Islam that the Islamic Republic has been imposing over the last 40-some years. And then, I can speak to the songs, but I think one song that I really want to highlight is Daya Daya Vakht Jangi, because it is a Lur song, and it was actually sung at the funeral of Nikah Shah Karami during the Women Life Freedom Uprising. So that's really become a folkloric song that's really becoming highlighted everywhere. And another random song, Dele Dige, which they sang first for a florist who was killed in Gorgan. And that random sort of pop song, it's a song about heartbreak, has now become a unifying sort of protest song at these funerals. But again, I think this is, if Women Life Freedom was explicitly started with demands for freedom over hijab, and women were very much, of course, central to that, as the name of the uprising goes. In this one, too, they were, not on sort of a name or anything, because a lot of the, men, most of the people who were killed were men, as was the case with Women Life Freedom, but they've been really leading culturally, thematically, what this uprising stands for. So the centrality of women here, again, has been shigeftangiz.
If I can, I'm going to ask a set of questions to bring us kind of more to the international level, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Maybe I'll actually, the next question I'll ask you, Ida. One of the refrains that I've heard a lot these past few weeks is that there's this, and this is an allegation, so you may actually dispute the whole allegation, but there's some who have argued both Iranian Americans, but others have argued that progressive voices, outlets, and personalities outside of Iran, in the West, in the US, in Europe, and so forth, have not expressed enough support for the protesters, especially early on. I think things have shifted, but especially in those opening few weeks. And instead, the left has been very focused on geopolitical concerns, US empire. Maybe events of these past few weeks suggest that they had right to be concerned for that, but there was more or too much attention on that. Given your engagement with progressive voices inside Iran, I'm wondering how this question does or does not actually gain traction and meaning amongst Iranians in Iran themselves. And is there evidence that Iranians in Iran have actually tried to build bridges with progressive outlets, or what's your take on this question from your vantage point?
Yeah, so the radical left, or just the progressive left, especially in the West, this is the hot topic of the day. I'm sure, at least, if not all of you, some of you have engaged in some form of debate online, or, have, at least, if you haven't, if you haven't been accused of personally or attacked, you know, you're in the picture. But yeah, personally, I share the concern. I think, this sort of contingent solidarity does exist when it comes to Iran, and it's the contingency is also about obviously geopolitical, situation, and so the solidarity is contingent upon whether Iranians say the right thing about Israel, about America, and about regime change. And if they don't, then they're imperialist dupes, right? They got duped. Which is, again, as I explained, there's a whole, material base underlying the, it's like the struggle of survival, of everyday survivor in Iran. So that's why it's important to, have that context, to know that, just to label these people as being engineered and manufactured by imperialists and this and that is not just a disservice. It's just both analytically and also strategically wrong, right? So it's analytically wrong because as Irvan mentioned earlier, these are sort of these are mass uprisings, right? And I mean, it happens in the context of, repression, in the context of a vacuum caused by repression, a vacuum of, an absence of any form of political, parties or oppositions in Iran, right? Any form of durable union organizing in Iran without facing any form of, repression or, prison or, torture event. Right, so you don't have any of these, political infrastructures. And so in the absence of it, what you have is mass uprising. And mass uprisings, by definition, are heterogeneous, right? It means that you have socialists in it, you have liberals in it, you have nationalists in it, you have monarchs in it, monarchists in it, and you have people who don't subscribe to any of these ideologies. They're just in the street because they're hungry, right? They want their wages. So you have this element of heterogeneity, and if you don't understand that, then you're just analytically wrong. You don't understand that that's just the very, definition of a mass uprising. You have all kinds of voices in there, especially in the context of a lack of, a solidified, party to kind of, give direction to where things go. And I also think it's strategically self-defeating for the international left and the Western left, because what happens is that when progressive forces kind of hesitate to take up a stance or even support, right? In the silence and in the vacuum that's created by the silence, what happens is that, those forces with the most resources and most media, appearances are going to take up the space, right? And they happen to be the right wings, as we know, warmongers, right? As we know. And so what happens is that they also create this duality of, that kind of, there's a false choice between Iran liberation and anti-imperialism. And there's a very strong anti-left sentiments currently happening in Iran. Those of you who follow, you see this. Essentially, left is a label that you attach to people if you want to say, they don't understand, they're stupid, or they just don't care about Iranians, right? And part of it is created by this vacuum that the Western left has caused. In the best case scenario, it's silence. The worst case scenario is outright support for the capitalist state of Islamic Republic, right? Which is suppressing people, suppressing Iranians. And so Iranians see that and they're like, oh, so our friend is the imperialist. Our friend is Trump because, they're the only ones supporting us, even though it's a bunch of lies and we know it. But that's how it appears from the inside. So this dynamic sort of strengthen the very imperial project that the left kind of says to kind of oppose, right? So in terms of Iranian, progressive movements goes, yes, there are clear signs that they do understand that. So I'm just going to mention 2 or 3 clear examples. So there has been statements from the teachers union and also from the Writers Association directly asking the global, progressive forces to support them, to kind of, suppress the uprising. And they're at the same time also, condemn the repression of the government. And the most recent statement, actually I think it was released 2 days ago by Tehran Bus Syndicate. It's one of the oldest syndicates, labor syndicates in Iran. The statement is very clear. They're anti-regime change, they're anti-war, they're anti the government's repression, they're anti-austerity, and all of the new liberal policies as well as the repression. So you hear it a lot in the West that you cannot you cannot choose between these two, because if you're against Iran's government, then how could you be anti-imperialist, right? These examples are very clear examples of working class people inside of Iran taking up a very clear yet simple stance and showing the West, and they're asking for concrete demands, which is to support us. They're asking for solidarity specifically. Now, so what should constructive solidarity look like for the Western left or the global left? I think it's just the first one would be to just keep the position principled and simple, and that is to oppose repression of any kind. At the same time, stand with the popular uprising, because at the end of the day, that uprising is about dignity and survival. And these are sort of the issues that we are dealing with all over the world, including in America, right? We are dealing with survival issues, right? Social reproduction issues with rent, healthcare. We have difficulty unionizing, even here in the US. So these are not some sort of alien demands that only Iranians have. These are sort of the issues that we're dealing with elsewhere. So, but it's legit. Except that in the case of Iran, we have this, multiple crises. So it's just this exceptional case because the crises are, multiplied by the sanctions, right? So that's why it's so dire. So yeah, reject projects of, your own government that instrumentalize any form of uprising to their own, benefits. That's the main thing. Reject war, reject sanctions, because it's punishing an entire nation, but at the same time support those uprisings. And it's very easy. Push your own union. If you're involved in any form of pro-Palestine organizations or student organization, have them to release any some concrete supporting statement. To support, labor organizing and to condemn the repression and the imprisonment of all of, these working class people in Iran right now. Yeah, I think I pretty much said everything that I wanted to.
Yeah, actually, I was going to go to you, Evan. Nahida, I'm going to turn to you last, if you don't mind, because I think this may be. We can continue this conversation and maybe even some difference of opinion, which is perfectly fine. Because, Iran is also a kind of a historian of this the long durée of Iranian modernity, one of the big themes has been independence, right? And Istiqlal was one of the few areas which brought secular and religious forces together in 1979, and so on and so forth. So I'm wondering, how you reflect on this current moment, where seemingly asking for outside powers to intervene does it contravene notions of independence? And how would you make sense of this historical conjuncture? Or how have you tried to make sense of it? Sorry about that. Your thoughts on this thorny issue?
Well, it's understandable when you have a very despicable regime. People get so frustrated, especially there's an economic crisis from below, that people grasp on anything. If Frankenstein's monster appeared, people would say, that it's better than the Huns. The question, as analysts or outsiders, I think we have the responsibility to look at it more objectively and try to analyze it. So it's understandable, though, that some people might want the Shah back, but how realistic that is. And also, I think, because the people dislike the regime, so for good reasons, they also actually misjudge the predicament Iran is in. Here I would like to talk about basically Iran's foreign policy. Because that's basically brings US in collision with Iran, and that's basically the reason for we will probably enter the war. Because the regime is despicable, people automatically think its foreign policy must be also despicable. I can think of actually a regime in the 1930s that was despicable internally, was impeccable in its foreign policy. I'm not saying the present regime in Iran is impeccable in foreign policy, but on the whole, if you look at the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, disregard the rhetoric, death to Israel, death to the United States. If you look at it, it's cool-headedly its policy. Despite all the rhetoric about anti-imperialism, it's been often willing to deal with the United States. In fact, on many times, even conservative governments like Rafsanjani were willing to negotiate and help United States in crises such as Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. And the problem has been not actually there, but it's been in Washington and Tel Aviv. It's been outsiders who have imposed the draconian sanctions. So that the foreign policy of Iran is not really the problem. The foreign policy of the United States and Israel is the problem. And it's easy for actually people inside Iran to say, well, if somehow the regime was more flexible, they could get a deal. Well, they got a deal with Obama, a perfectly good deal. Why was that deal basically washed down the toilet? It wasn't because of Iran, it was because of the United States and Israel. So here often the regime is despicable, but doesn't mean its foreign policy is despicable. Even now, I think that they would be willing to come to an agreement, but we don't know what the demands are from our side here. If they're unacceptable demands, I'm sure they'll be more than willing to actually go into war. Khamenei is 86. He has cancer. His days are numbered. He would probably rather die as a martyr for the revolution rather than die in bed. So they're willing to actually make some sort of agreement. But when the people in Washington speak, it's all jumbled up. You can't understand what is their demand. If you go to war, you have to have some sort of basically end results you want to get, and they're intentionally not giving it. it may be that that's clever, that then you can come in agreement and say, well, we got what we want, or it could be more sinister. It may be, they talk about regime change. Okay, that term regime change is a new euphemism for a military coup d'etat. There is no possibility of a military coup d'etat unless the bystanders take over and push aside the clerics and have a symbolic head convert the Islamic Republic to an imamate. But that's not going to solve the problem with the United States and Israel. It actually would become more of a nightmare. So you have to think, if they're rational, and I presume they're rational in Washington, Tel Aviv, what is their purpose? My suspicion is actually they want more than regime change. They want the destruction of the country. I mean, they succeeded with Iraq, they succeeded with Syria, they succeeded with Yemen, they succeeded with Libya. Dismantling of the state is not that hard if you decapitate the leadership, pour arms into the country, have a civil war, and then for the next 10, 15 years, the place is going to be a mess. So when people talk about why doesn't the left talk about the issue, the question is many people on the left are aware of history, aware of not ancient history, but the last 40 years, and are much more cautious. They don't want to fall into the same trap that many leftists in Iraq fell when they called for the liberation of Iraq by United States. So it's best to keep records of people who are now calling for American invasion, because when shit hits the fan, it's best to know who are the people who actually were calling for this invasion. I'll stop there.
Okay. I think, unfortunately, a little bit connected is my next and probably last question to the panel. Naheed, one specter that's kind of hovered over this whole evening is the question of the diaspora, what is now called the diaspora. We used to not use that term, it's a new term, and so I'm kind of surprised to be thought of as being part of the diaspora, but I guess we are now. The young kids tell me I'm part of the diaspora. I'll take it, I guess, I don't know. Seems like a lot of responsibility. But on that theme, when in your earlier response you were talking about what's different about these protests, I think I'm correct in saying that since Women, Life, Freedom, but especially in a kind of a supercharged form this past few weeks, the role of, or the visibility and the loudness of the diaspora has been incredibly significant. Here in New York at our university, Washington Square Park has been a hotbed for diasporic gatherings and so forth. I'm sure some friends have maybe participated in them or witnessed them on Instagram and all those fancy places. But more importantly than that are a lot of media outlets, Iran International, Manatul, even BBC Persian and so forth, who have prioritized and platformed particular oppositional voices, anti-regime voices, and I think it's fair to say primarily pro-monarchist voices and the pro-Reza Pahlavi line of analysis and messaging and so forth. You've been a journalist yourself. You have a close analytical lens to understand how media works. I'm just wondering if you could think about this category of the diaspora and how it's emerged in relationship to media. And then, and the question, and this is a genuine question, we use this term diaspora as a way to think about, well, there's Iranians over there, there are Iranians in Iran and the Iranians outside. And I more and more wonder if this simple binary is actually is valid and useful in the 21st century. Does media, satellite TV, social media, has it broken down that division of diaspora and inside? And if you can reflect on that.
I think to a great extent it has. And I think the tragedy of this moment is partly borne by mainstream media, is the failure of our media. I heard John Bolton being questioned very seriously this morning on the radio about regime change in Iran. This is a guy who was part and parcel of a complete failed sort of regime change in another place where millions of people died, and somehow he's platformed as an expert on recommending regime change in Iran. I think our media have failed us so badly. It's tragic, and it's, these things are all interconnected because our media normalized a genocide in Gaza. We were all witness to that unfolding in front of our eyes. And once you normalize the killing of so many people, all of them Muslims, of course, there's more of a tolerance toward going into another country and potentially killing a lot more Muslims there. And of course, the diaspora that you're talking about, they're mistaken. They don't see themselves as Muslims. They think they are on the side of the white people or whoever is going to come and rescue them. And I think, when we look at, these media that have been empowered, and by the way, this is, of course, the first body to blame for this lack of information, disinformation, lack of media, lack of insight into what's happening in Iran is actually in part the Islamic Republic itself, right? Because the Islamic Republic for decades has had a state media that has fabricated news, misrepresented everything that's going out there, that's happening out there. And so Iranians have turned to alternative sources of media, whether it's these YouTubers who have like 5,000 followers that people watch, or the Kuche program, or Iran International, which is the most watched news outlet for among Iranians inside Iran. Outside of Iran, of course, among a certain sort of diasporic group, but inside of Iran, the majority of Iran that is their source of news, right? And these academics in Sweden did a study where they looked at thousands, I forget how many, like 8,000 videos, and tried to monitor in how many of those protests in these videos that they watched, they've verified the authenticity of place and this and that. The chant of Javid Shah was given, and it was something like 18%. But when they then examined how many of these videos were platformed on Iran International, it was 80% or 88% of their videos. I'm forgetting the exact number, right? So it's a misrepresentation of what's happening on the ground. None of this is to say that there aren't Iranians who are supporting Reza Pahlavi. And in fact, I think that is kind of increasing now on the ground. This is in part because I'm in touch with family and friends in Iran, and I'm stunned by my own conversations with people who would have never said the things that they say today. It's a tragedy that has been unfolding on two tracks. On one track, it's the vacuum that the Islamic Republic has created, the repression of any kind of dissent, of any kind of alternative political possibilities inside of Iran itself. And on the other hand is this regime change discourse that has been supported, that has been nurtured within the first Trump government with 2016 with the extreme sanctions and the leaving of the deal. Already then, there was the Iran Disinfo campaign, which was a campaign funded by the US State Department to basically cancel anybody who had any kind of nuanced understanding of Iran. Journalists, experts, most of them women. Actually, it was the women who were destroyed in those campaigns. And so we are left in, when you cancel out everybody who has any kind of nuanced insight into Iran, you are left with a media outlet that is very much right-wing aligned. And I think the tragedy of this moment is that, we have seen the breakdown of civil discourse and democratic norms in the United States, and those are precisely the forces that are funding the media for the diaspora that are becoming more and more prominent and louder by the day, right? That's the diaspora. It's their funding, their media have been supported. These are discourses that we've seen happen since 2016, and of course with the new Trump government, it's just 7-8 months ago, people in Iran went out on the streets with the bombardments of Israel and then the US to protest against war. How could it be that within 7-8 months, Iranians are now asking to be attacked by the US? And this is happening among a sizable Iranian population, right? and I think the media have a lot to do with it. It doesn't mean, but you know, when I was talking to one of my sort of very bright student who does research for me in Iran, because she argued for this, she said, you know what, we're not naive. We know what war means. It's going to bring destruction. It's going to bring bombs. Lots of people are going to die. I'm scared, but we just need to get rid of the Islamic Republic. Not really thinking about the consequences of how is this war even supposed to get rid of the state, right? Don't you need sort of other means than just destroying the country from above? Because there's not going to be any manpower going into Iran, right? But I was trying to figure out, is there a way in which I can see this as an agentive sort of, you know, demand or request by Iranians? If I have a super bright student in Iran who's asking for, is there a way that I can consider this as an agentive request? And I just don't think we can, because these are demands that are coming out of an extremely desperate situation, right? Both in terms of what they are dealing with their own government, as well as this, you know, sort of the extreme sanctions and the extreme poverty and the sort of dead end of a politics that really the U.S. has imposed on Iran, U.S. and you know, aided by I mean, yeah, Israel and other countries who've also just gone along with this. So it's a desperate situation. Sorry, I don't even know what you asked me, but I hope I addressed some of that. Yeah.
No, I think it captures the mood that many of us have had, this sense of desperation, of course. I have many other questions, but I'm mindful that we have a room full of thoughtful, intelligent folks who have probably many questions, and I suspect we have a large online community as well. To remind the folks on online, just type in your questions in the question and answer section. We will try our best to get to at least some of those, but we're going to begin with the folks that are here with us. If you could be brief and concise. If your question is directed to a specific person, that's fine. If it's directed to the entire panel, that is, of course, also fine. If you could just, I think you're going to need to wait for the microphone, but the gentleman right there in the green.
Thank you. I'm curious about these Starlink internet terminals that supposedly have been smuggled into Iran, thousands of them. What do you know about that? Are you in touch with anybody through an internet Starlink terminal? What have those conversations been about? Who have they been given to? Those kind of things.
Does anyone want to? Someone in the back had a question, sorry. Yeah, maybe we should collect, let's collect two more, and then the panelists can try to do their best with answering them.
My question is from Ida. It seemed to me that you see a continuity between the demands of the labor movement and what we have on the streets. And what I find very striking, and we saw this in the Women Life Freedom as well, is that actually there is no demand. No demand is being articulated there. It's just that we want to get rid of the Islamic Republic. It's really not clear what we want to replace it with. But when you look at the labor movement, for example, like their statements on May 1st, year after year, you see that they have very particular demands. Like we want free healthcare, we want free education, we want like equality between like Afghan and Iranian workers. So I wonder like what kind of demands do you see in these protests that you think are in congruence with labor movement demands? And I just also had a very brief comment about these joyous ceremonies. Actually, not all of them were joyous, but I'm really worried about the joyous ones, because we know from psychoanalysis that if you don't mourn, bad things are going to happen. So, you know, like, I'm very worried about the mental health of a nation that has even lost its capacity to mourn because of the Islamic Republic. Thank you.
Maybe one last, I think she said one last question, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Thank you for the great panel. I kind of wanted to complicate the situation a little bit further. I'm very glad that we are talking about labor demands and economic grievances in the country, and it is obvious that like the protest started from labor demands. But we know from like other waves, from analysis, historical analysis, discourse analysis, interviews with protests, that in Iran we have multiple levels of fault lines. We have a very serious gender discrimination, we have ethnic discrimination, we have, of course, worker strikes and like labor, like economic struggles, and we also have problems against the religious dictatorship. And any time that we see this mass uprisings, what usually happens is that an event really triggers the event, and then people with various demands kind of join the protest, and protest becomes about everything and nothing at the same time. I was wondering how you see the economic conditions intersect with some of these other demands that have existed so far, and kind of complicate the picture a little bit more by talking about other grievances and other demands that people have. Thank you.
Okay. Nahid, do you want to take any one of those questions that you feel?
Sure, I'll just briefly respond to the one about mourning. Starling, unfortunately, I don't know. I know, I forget the number, but something like 800, I believe, were distributed, given out in Iran via, different channels, and I don't actually have a whole lot of information about it, but I know that some of them were given to people who have ISPs, internet service providers, and yeah. It's worth looking into who actually got to have them and use them. I wonder if anybody else here has more information on that, but I actually haven't seen much out there in terms of these Starlinks that have been there. And about the mourning, yeah, I think actually these are, I think people are mourning. They're just mourning in a different way. I don't think they're not mourning. And you see that, you see on the faces of people, on the weight on the shoulders of these mothers who are choosing to dance instead of cry, you see the pain and you see that they're mourning, but they're choosing to mourn differently. And you see that's a political statement, right? For all of us who've seen these ceremonies. Some of them, there's the exuberant one for the Gorgon flower seller. Even in that one, in the first, in the foreground, you see a grandmother who's just completely lost and is trying to figure out what's going on, because it's in those sort of rites of passage, in that very transformative, almost sort of utopian redescription of what this community should mean, right? They're trying to sort of reinscribe themselves anew and through these acts of mourning. But I wouldn't say they're not mourning. I think they're just mourning differently.
Okay, so Cyrus' question, very good question about why the workers or these labor, movements have a very concrete demand and why the uprising doesn't have any demand. And I think it points to the very fact that one is organized, the other isn't, right? One is organized, they have very clear demands, and they know what they want, they know how they want it. And it's interesting because it used to be much more progressive, right? So during the 2017-2018, for example, teachers union, the teachers, mass strikes of even up to 2021, one of the demands was, for example, free education, and education with mother tongue, right? Native language, which is banned in Iran. And also for workers, like we had the council, movement in Iran. The workers were demanding full control of the workplace, right? And Haftepe and Fulad Ahvaz, very interesting stuff. But then the more and more deteriorating the situation gets, the demands are becoming more and more basic. So even with the teachers union, you don't hear anything about free education anymore. Now it's just, we want wages. Right, we want the very basic demands. And, same thing with all of those labor movements, like they were suppressed, the progressive head was, just kind of cut. And then now the rest of the, working class body, they just want to survive. Just to put it in a context, recent data shows that at least 70% of Iranians are facing malnutrition currently, right? I'm talking to my family in Iran, and they can no longer afford eggs, yogurt. They have to buy things on installment, right? Credit system doesn't exist in Iran. So people cannot afford food anymore. And so this is just like the general, like economic situation that's happening in Iran. And so when you're facing that level of, misery and poverty, you don't care about progressive demands of free education, right? You want your wage. You want your 6-month delayed wages. the food inflation, the yearly food inflation, I was just checking today from the Statistical Center of Iran, is 100 and, if I'm not wrong, 110% more than what it was last year this time, and that's just the food, right? So, yeah, when you have demands like this, then the progressive demands goes away. But to answer, going back to what Saira was saying, I was just like reading this kind of testimony from someone that was in the protest, and this just kind of speaks to the shapelessness of the uprising when it's not organized, right? And this testimony was from, the progressive people who, were in the crowd. And it was kind of interesting, and they were describing a group of young people, like kind of Gen Z people. They were just like going ahead, and someone just yelled, some chants, and everyone else repeated. It's shapeless, right? You can just yell something, people are just going to repeat it. So someone just going to yell Javid Shah, everyone else going to repeat it, right? Because it's not organized again. And so these people that were, I was like reading their testimony, they were saying that they chanted woman, life, freedom. And these young people turned around, and I was just like, what? Woman, life, freedom, you got your demands, right? You wanted a job to be, you got your demands. It's our time, right? And then so they went on to say non-kar azadi, right? Hukumat shorai, which is bread, job freedom, council, governance, something like that. And the young people were like, what is that? Like, what is shura? What are you talking about? And so these people, proceeded to explain that the shura, the council governance, is essentially that the power is to shura, your shura. You can, you're the state, you're the next state, you don't have to chant this and that. And they were like, oh, okay. So, the very fact that there's no demand doesn't mean that there's no demand, right? It's just that there's no really any outlet to kind of redirect these demands, which are all survival, obviously. I hope I answered the question. Very good question, and you're absolutely right, because there are, the 2016 and 17 uprising, the first one, the Day Navadoshish, right? That one was precisely about poverty, right? That was about, unpaid wages and, unemployment and all of that. And then went on the Bloody Aban, Navadohash. That one was about fuel crisis, right? The fuel subsidy was removed and all of that. And then you have the uprising, the Keramat, right, in 2021. You have the Thirsty uprising in Khuzestan. And these are in the predominantly, Arab, Khuzestan Arab and Lor. And obviously there's like very strong ethnic discrimination happening to these people who are either not Shia or not Persian, right? And in terms of the Arab that I know personally, because of the location of Khuzestan that I looked at, they're systematically kind of pushed back. They cannot work even for the oil company, right? Arabs can't work for the oil company. It's not a written law, obviously. But it's just some form of, So the poverty is striking in those areas that you see. These are the, that's why I said undeveloped areas. And if you look at, like the data that comes out about the general poverty, today actually came out one, and 30% of people, for example, in Elam, where this current uprising started from, this past uprising, 30% of people in that region live below poverty line, right? So you do see sort of these patterns that ethnic issues are overlapping with underdevelopment, with discrimination, and comes with poverty, right? Jina uprising started from Kurdistan, Sanandaj, right? And they have a very long, history of organizing and all of that, but at the same time, subjugation, and which was not, it did not started with this current state, right? It was, it was far back, going back to the Pahlavi. Which is interesting enough, he released a statement yesterday condemning Kurdish forces, coalition, kind of sounding exactly like the, Islamic government in terms of saying that they need to be suppressed and all of that. So yeah, all of these demands converge. And in terms of gender, again, you're absolutely right, because when you have the crisis of social reproduction, which is this hefty, term that social scientists use to explain the crisis of, everyday life, which is essentially anything that you need to do in order to keep working and stay alive. For example, care work, and rent, and the healthcare, your wages, all of that. These are predominantly, when you see these crises are, facing the household, these are predominantly on the shoulder of women, obviously, and that's not just Iran, elsewhere too. That's just, that's how the society is structured. But in terms of Iran, as you mentioned, there's also another dimension of the patriarchal legal system that prevent, resources away from women, especially in terms of employment. Women have a hard time to, get jobs compared to men. And when they do get jobs, it's much shorter. The work condition is much worse, right? So then that you have the Jina uprising, and I don't think that it was all about hijab. It was about the condition, the gendered, discriminatory condition that goes far, above and beyond hijab. And also in the current uprising, not the current, I mean the recent one too. You have, for example, before the, the suppression of the Thursday and Friday, the day before, actually on Wednesday, there was this uprising organized by women in east side of Tehran, right? And so you have like videos of it, and you see it was organized by women. Women were leading it. So you do have things like that. That when we're talking about the social crisis, or the crisis of survival, women are also at the forefront of being receptive to it. I hope I answered your question about Starlink. Sorry. So I don't know personally anyone, but I know that people are really aware of it, because if they get arrested, they could actually be sentenced, potentially to death for using Starlink. But I know that something interesting, that a couple of days ago they arrested a Dutch diplomat in the airport because they had Starlink in their luggage.
Yeah, Ron, do you want to respond to any of the questions? Why don't we, Leila, I'll come to you in a moment for questions from the Zoom, but
thank you. Thank you so much for the great conversation. My question is about the sanctions and the fact that you said that we cannot think that people in Washington or Tel Aviv are stupid, so there should be a plan behind it. So considering the fact that Khomeini was being safely guarded in a Western country and was delivered with a plane to Iran, and this whole sanction idea that started from the beginning is just getting worse and worse, and the fact that sanctions enable the government to take the money out in a faster speed and cause more problem for people, not for the government. And then we have evacuation from Afghanistan that created the fact that so many people from Afghanistan who were trained military by US came to Iran. Do you think this plan was from 47 years ago to destroy the country, or this was just a new plan based on these sanctions? Like, when you look at it historically, how far do you think they were thinking about how to destroy Iran as a country?
It's hard to figure out because they often didn't articulate it, even in secret documents that I've seen. But clearly, the revolution and the hostage crisis left a bad taste in people's mouths in Washington. And they were eager to punish Iran. And the way of punishing Iran was the sanctions. But then what was the end aim of it? I think in the beginning they thought this could actually bring down the regime. That didn't work. So the question is why the more intense sanctions as time has passed. So it's not really draconian. I don't think any country has actually suffered such type of sanctions. I mean, just to give you an example, Iran actually got one of the highest rates of COVID because it had so much relations with China. They asked for, from our international bodies, $5 billion to help deal with it. They got 5 million pittance. It was even hard to get any COVID medicines to Iran during the sanctions. The argument was, well, you have to guarantee that this won't go to the bystanders. They're a terrorist organization. So this was an incredibly inhumane process. So the question becomes, are these people who implement these inhumane process, are they sadistic? Are they getting pleasure of it? I don't think so. I mean, some of them may be, but on the whole, when you have governments, administration one after another pursuing it, there must be an agenda to it. And the agenda, I think, is basically the destruction of what they call the regime. But I think since you're not going to get a simple destruction of the regime, you'd have to go further, a destruction of the state, the country. And it sounds very sort of maximalist, but it's worked elsewhere. And they probably think that it will work there. And of course, the Iranian attitude is, well, we're different. We're not Arabs. It won't happen here. Somehow we're more civilized. And wherever you look in the world, civilization is veneer deep. Once you scratch it, you find savagery. Even Yugoslavia, you can see what happened once the state is destroyed.
So yeah, there's a bunch of questions online, and I'm going to just cluster them into 3, and hopefully we can respond to the rest in other ways. The first one is actually a continuation of the sanctions. There's a whole bunch of questions about the sanctions in the chat, but one thing that I think hasn't been spoken about. So the question is, if sanctions and embargoes can trigger episodes of uprisings, why don't we see similar uprisings in places like Cuba? That have also been under sanctions. So this direct correlation, if you can take an internationalist approach to it. The second question, a number of questions for Professor Abrahamian around Iran's foreign policy and how Iran's foreign policy, as you deemed it, has been sane. The question is, how do you account for spending billions of dollars with the economic crisis that's inside of Iran on Hezbollah, Hamas, and so on and so forth. They're quoting Wall Street Journal. But most of the foreign policy questions are around Iran's foreign policy in regards to Israel. So if you could respond to your framework in relation to Israel. And then the third question is, why is there not more talk of political prisoners inside of Iran as potential alternative future leaders? Why is the focus primarily on Reza Pahlavi rather than folks who are inside Iran? Mousavi is one name that's come up. Of course, there's others. Yeah, those are the key questions.
Should we go this direction?
Well, as far as Israel is concerned, I mean, sure, the rhetoric we all know, definitely. But when you look closely, there have been Iranian presidents who've actually gone on record saying that we accept two-state solution if it's acceptable to the Palestinians. So if someone in Washington or Tel Aviv was eager to have some sort of route, that would be a good place to actually latch on. And even now, actually, Iran has accepted the Saudi proposal. And the Saudi proposal, again, states that the two-state solution. So in some ways, actually, the Iranian government's position is more actually progressive than the State Department in Washington, because they seem to have forgotten about the two-state solution. The second
Sanctions, why aren't there protests in Cuba?
Okay, I mean, Cuba is a smaller country, and I think the intention is the same, to bring down the Cuban regime. It's a much more, I think, tightly knit society. And not to be so orientalist, Iranians have the tendency to rebel much more than Cubans. I mean, you can see the history of protests. So it's, I think that there, it's easier, it's harder for the Iranian government to repress unless it uses massive force. And in Cuba, of course, history hasn't finished. We don't know what will happen there. But I think there's a strong, basically, a state on the grassroots level in Cuba that manages on sort of very local level, which this regime in Iran doesn't have that.
Sure, I'll pick up on the question about why aren't political prisoners in Iran, I think this was online, sort of raised, or mentioned as much as opponents or as much as Reza Pahlavi. And I think, this has to do with many years of these smear campaigns against all of these activists by actually right-wing allied groups in the US and their media that have also gone into Iran. I mean, on the one hand, you have the Islamic Republic, of course, smearing all these activists and imprisoning them and silencing them. On the other hand, you have these media outlets that come out with all kinds of, smear campaigns against Narges Mohammadi, against anybody, all of them. I mean, we've just seen this even with beloved sort of figures like Golshifte Farahani or somebody as respected as Christian Amanpour. We see how they can be dragged into the mud and completely smeared and canceled in this media. And then if you ask any of these, pro-Pahlavi diaspora people what exactly it is that Narges Mohammadi has done wrong, there really isn't much except the Barchaspe Chapia, Chapul. Like they're just awful lefties and they're communists. I mean, before all of this started in the first Trump term, there were all kinds of viral social media memes painting Khamenei as somebody who went to Patrice Lumumba in Russia and as a communist. And so this sort of the trope of the communists and of the leftists has become so cumbersome and so dark for so many of these people that they've basically been canceled. And so you have Reza Pahlavi, who is becoming, I see this happening in those voices that I'm paying attention to inside of Iran, and they're sort of, across the spectrum, they're being quite strategic, right? They're saying, who is there who can actually lead us out of this quagmire into a transitional space, into a transitional phase, and get us out of this hell? The perception and the framing that they have of Reza Pahlavi is often not the same as the one that people have in the diaspora, or at least the ones that we see in California or elsewhere, who are, canceling anybody who says the slightest thing about Pahlavi not being the ultimate leader or whatever. They have a different perception of that. The voices that are coming out of Iran that are supporting that, there are of course those who want to have a monarchy and all of that, but they're thinking about it more strategically in terms of a phase of transition out of, getting us out of the Islamic Republic. But something that I wanted to also mention that I didn't is the, sort of Islamophobia that feeds all of this and that has bled into social media spaces in Iran as well. Pahlavi has had people around him who, like Ali Karimi, the soccer player who's called for people to burn their Qurans. Actually, one scholar recently posted on Facebook somebody else's post, and I was stunned by this because this is a scholar based in, in the West, but reposting somebody's post saying Happy Ramadan to Iranians is insulting. It's like saying Heil Hitler to Jews. I mean, aside from all the problems of that comparison, which just was like, on so many levels just doesn't compare. But, these kinds of, I think the discourse has become, people are trying to latch on to something. And so out of a sense of desperation, in order to get out of this, I think the discourse has become reductive, simplified, and so it's easier to latch on to Reza Pahlavi than to any of these other possibilities, to give them some thought, to really, so I think Reza Pahlavi really has, has become this sort of placeholder because of all kinds of yeah, I'll just leave it there. Before I get.
Yeah, I'd like to add to this. The monarchist obsession with the left is interesting because try to analyze it, because the left was hardly strong in the revolution or in recent history. So why are they obsessed by it? I think the explanation is it goes back to the Shah. When there were about millions of people in the street, he kept on telling the American and the British ambassadors, it's all the work of the Russians, the communists. They kept on saying, we have no evidence of that. There's none of that. But the notion, premise was basically the people are happy, the clerics don't have the ability to do this, so it must be these sinister communists behind the scenes who are pulling all the strings. So the revolution is then blamed on the left. The left had some role, but it certainly did not make the revolution. So it becomes a scapegoat for them to argue that the left was responsible. They take people personally responsible because you actually opposed the Shah from a leftist point. That's you brought the Akhuns to power. So that explains their basically obsession. In American politics, I always find it funny when people talk about the left. I'm not sure what they mean, American left. Is it the Clintons or what? But if you stand somewhat to the right of Attila the Hun, everyone looks like a leftist. And there's, I think, a concerted effort, actually, in the mainstream media. Why isn't the left not speaking up? Why are they concerned about the left speaking up? I mean, when you get various different journals like Atlantic with this article, why isn't the left not speaking up about the protest? Of course, they are speaking up. What they mean is, why aren't they calling for the US to invade? So it's, when someone uses the left in American politics as well as Iranian politics, I'm on guard what they're already talking about.
If I could just add one footnote before I give it to, if I can just add one footnote before I turn it to Ida. When that was really, that line of analysis was really popular in mid-January, at that point already Bernie Sanders, Mahmoud Mamdani, and AOC had come out with very strong statements in support of the protesters. So I found it very strange. It's actually the three most notable people on the left in the United States had already, well before anyone else had actually talked about the protesters.
But they're not calling for invasion.
But they're not, exactly, but they weren't calling for invasion and ratcheting up sanctions. But let me give the last word to Ida.
I had something to say about the left, but I forgot now. Well, okay, so the Atlantic. Atlantic is notoriously now a Zionist. You know, the person who wrote that article was an IDF, essentially soldier, that interviewed a bunch of Iranian scholars about why the left is silent. And I do understand that, there's a whole smear campaign from the right, opposed to the left, to the Western left, for the so-called silence. And that's generally to just, use that whole vacuum more to just say, we care about Iranians and so on and so forth. But I do think that we should be able to create some space within the left to be able to criticize each other, right? At some point I was also sick and tired of hearing all of this thing from the right-wingers of why the left, because, who's the left? And the left is, we're not having power. We're struggling even to, understand what is our next, strategy, right? We're not even organized. And that's like a, big struggle for the left globally, right? Including in Iran and including in the US. But anyway, so about sanctions and why there's no protest in Cuba, I'm not a specialist on Cuba. I don't really know much about Cuba, but I can tell you about Iran. and that is that sanctions are tools, right? They're just, inflicted. But what happens when they're inflicted goes back to the inner dynamic, the local dynamic, and the governance, and how a state is going to respond to the sanctions, right? Because we do have we have China, where China has been under sanctions too, but then they, developed their, the whole sort of things that, Iran uses a lot, resistance economy, that has practically failed in Iran. Their resistant economy worked, right? Now, I don't really know about the context in, Cuba, but in Iran, what happened is that off of the back of these sanctions, we have grave inequality in Iran. We have a certain, faction of the state who has made a lot of money, right? A lot of money just because of the sanctions. We have the trustees, we have people who use, the whole getting around, the oil export and all of that. We have people inside that get, dollar with the, with like the lower rate, the state rate dollar, and to import stuff. And what they do is that, they just sell the, the currency in the free market, and they make a lot of money. And who are these people? These people are the sons and the families of the IRGC members. So you hear this a lot from some faction of the left, that the oligarchs, the state needs to take care of the oligarchs. But who are the oligarchs? The oligarchs is the state, right? And so you have this incredible amount of corruption happening in Iran, right? And what's striking is that, we've been in a sort of a hybrid war with Israel and US for a long time, but it's become more and more, obvious since October 7th, but specifically during the 12 days war, right? And so any sane government, even we're talking about the new liberal Western governance, right? You do place in some level of, wartime controlled economy, that you give, subsidies to people to be able to afford food, What happened in Iran was that in the middle of an uprising in January, right? What did the state do? What did the government do? They removed the subsidy. It's as if like they're shooting themselves in the foot. It's as if like they're, subjecting themselves to fall, right? And so it's kind of actually interesting to watch this whole dynamic of, how some of these policies that they're not even, obviously there are a lot of fights within the different factions of the government. There are factions who do realize that you do need some level, like basic level of protection for the society to not fall, right? Which we're seeing. A lot of people within the government has been, warning about, what's coming from years ago. But at the end of the day, this is what's happening. Now, I doubt if the same situation is happening in Cuba, and maybe that's why you don't have uprising. Maybe it's a different level, but it's not just, from an outside, like pressure. It's what that outside pressure does inside the country. There's this book authored by Nephew called The Art of Sanctions, and you might have heard of it. It's been translated by the Research Institute of Majlis in Iran, and there's been a lot of discussion around it, and that precisely, this person was in charge of some of the sanctions that was placed on Iran. This person is very candid about the fact that, the art of sanction, the sanctions work the best if the government is actually corrupt, and let it work, right? So we just put it there, and we're just going to sit here to see how it works, right? And we see how it worked in Iran. So I think we should have like a little more complicated understanding of how sanctions generally work.
Okay, we'll end with that. You have homework to do. Figure out how sanctions work. Before we wrap it up, Richard Nephew was the author of them. Let me, before we wrap this up and I thank the panelists, let me just make one very brief announcement regarding ISI events. We will be having 3 more events from the semester. Unfortunately, I don't have the dates written down, but in late March we'll have an online event actually about the Iranian diaspora. And then we'll have 2 events in April. Both of them will be historians that will be presenting their research actually a historian and an architectural historian, will be presenting. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact dates. Please join the email list, the ISI email list.
And April 30th.
Ali knows. April 10th and April 30th, which is Thursdays. Our meetings are usually on Thursdays. So April 10th and April 30th, 5 o'clock. But please sign up for the email list or follow us and Kevorkian on social media or email us. But with that, let me please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for a very stimulating panel.
I just want to say something quickly. So with my friend and comrade Manija Moradian, we co-edited a whole series on Iran, and a lot of the talks and questions that brought up today here is actually discussed there. We have 7 wonderful articles written on the Kurdish question, the Arab question, the social reproduction and gender issues, political economy. Wonderful, historical account of political economy in Iran, which actually really, historicized this whole situation very beautifully on the diaspora politics, on the media co-option of the protest, and on the feminist aspect of this uprising. So please go on Jadaliya and check this dossier. It was my little self-promotion of it. Thank you everyone.